Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this morning. My name is Katie Domrat. I am the Adult Programs Coordinator at the BMFA. We're so glad you could be here today. My colleague, Dr. Theresa Cunningham, is here. She is the Assistant Curator of European Art and the Mellon Collection, and she's going to talk about a special exhibition that we have up at the moment called Experimental Lines. We're going to talk about a few pieces in this exhibition. And with that, I will pass off to you, Theresa.
Thanks, Katie. And thanks everyone for coming this afternoon, this morning. So the exhibition that I'm going to talk about is called Experimental Lines, Impressionist and Post-Impressionist Drawings from the collection of Mr. and Mrs. Paul Mellon. I conceived of the exhibition when I first got to VMFA because I wanted to do something to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the first Impressionist exhibition, which happened between April 15th and May 15th, 1874. And many museums are organizing special events and exhibitions to commemorate this. The biggest of these is an exhibition happening right now in Paris at the Musée d'Orsay that will travel to Washington, D.C. to the National Gallery in the fall. But lots of smaller projects are in the works as well. And when we think about Impressionism, we think about artists who were interested in color, in atmosphere, who were creating these ephemeral scenes of everyday life. And we often think of their work as painters. However, all of the Impressionists had a very robust drawing practice. And 40% of the works that were on view in the first Impressionist exhibition were works on paper. And so I wanted to use this exhibition to highlight drawing and explain how fundamental it was to the Impressionist project, because it was an important way for them to take risks and experiment and work through ideas and compositions and test things out that kind of helped to establish the style that we know and love today. However, sometimes I think it's helpful to take a step backwards and think about what came before. When we think about Impressionism as kind of turning away from the style that was before, they chose to exhibit on their own. Many of them kind of rejected some of the classical training that they had. But I think to put it in context, it's useful to look at art from the earlier part of the 19th century to kind of think about the ways Impressionists were doing something different. So in the early 19th century, the French Academy was the leader in art education. In France, it was a state-run kind of organization that trained artists. And it really emphasized drawing as the foundation for all other art. So you couldn't become a good painter, sculptor, or architect if you weren't first a good draftsman. And artists would start by learning to draw after plaster casts, and then they would kind of graduate to working from live models. And from there, they could register as copyists at the Louvre, where they could make drawings after works of art in the museum. The star pupil of the Academy was Jean Auguste Donic, and he really embraced this. He was interested in, he began working in a style called neoclassicism that had an emphasis on line and precision, and was really thinking about the solid forms of classical art. In 1801, Ang won the Prix de Rome, which was the premier prize of the French Academy. And this award provided funds to study in Italy for 4 years. So it took Ang a little while to get to Italy, but in 1806 he arrived, and he immediately loved his time there. He spent time looking at ancient sculpture, at Renaissance and Baroque art, really studying these things and sort of absorbing the stylistic influences of these earlier movements. And in 4 years, when his time was up, he decided that he did not want to go back to France. And so in order to fund his continual stay in Italy, he established a business making drawn portraits of tourists coming through Italy. At this time, it's the era of the Grand Tour, this sort of important cultural education for wealthy young men who would kind of travel to important cultural sites in Europe to see ancient sculpture, sites from antiquity, major European cities. And so there were a lot of people coming through Italy at this time. And Ang really capitalized on this and used it as an opportunity to explore or to kind of create drawings that people could take home as souvenirs. And that's what we see here on the screen now. This is a portrait of the Reverend Joseph Church. He was a rector who traveled through Italy with his brother. Ong did a portrait of his brother as well that's now in another collection. But you can see here on the screen, he gives a lot of very careful attention to the sitter's face. We see these very fine lines, very carefully drawn, that really articulate, this kind of softness around his eyes and the wrinkles in his face. But the rest of the composition is done in a much more loose and free style. We see this kind of series of zigzags here that show the way that his jacket is kind of bunched. He has a little crook in his elbow, and really quick circles to suggest the buttons on his jacket. So it's a kind of, we can see here, the way that Ong has a very precise style that he's implementing for the face, but at the same time, he's making a lot of these portraits and he was working rather quickly. So certain details are done in quick execution. And you'll also note that he's using graphite only, so there's no color on this drawing. With the kind of academic emphasis on line, it was often seen as something that was sort of a precursor to color. And later in his career, Ong would often become contrasted against a younger artist, Eugene Delacroix, who worked in a style that became known as Romanticism. And Romanticism had a much greater emphasis on emotion, on color, than neoclassical art did. And Delacroix, as you can see from these drawings here, shows, though, that line and color don't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive, that you can incorporate both in a composition. So what we're looking at here is a sheet from a sketchbook. In 1832, Delacroix was invited to participate on a French diplomatic envoy to Morocco. He was the only artist included in the group, and he kept meticulous sketchbooks during this trip. He would sketch, animals. This is a sheet of camels, but also people and architectural sites that he saw there. And sometimes he would make these sketches quickly in pencil, and then at the end of the day, he would go back and highlight certain areas with watercolor, as we see here. And although Delacroix only went to North Africa once, African themes predominated throughout his work for the rest of his life. And so he would often look back to these sketchbooks at the kind of series of vignettes that he had collected throughout his travels and use these sketches as inspiration for later works. And you can see here, just as Ong is giving sort of careful attention to the face of the Reverend, Delacroix does the same with the camels. So we see them in a range of positions. They're seeming kind of tired, angry. He really captures sort of the emotion and the vibrancy of their faces. Sometimes they're put in a landscape. And so it's a kind of prolonged study of a single form. And this relationship between color and line working together is something that we'll continue to see in work by the Impressionists. So the Impressionists largely rejected the kind of training that was proposed by the Academy and supported by them. They opted not to show at the Salon, which was the major art exhibition organized by the Academy each year, and instead worked together to host their own exhibitions, which they did 8 times between 1874 and 1886. But even as they kind of looked to a new way of approaching things than the academic training, they did not abandon drawing. We often think about Impressionism and later Post-Impressionism as movements that are solely about color, but line is sort of still foundational to these works as well. And of the Impressionists, Degas was by far the most prolific draftsman. However, he really engages in all media. At VMFA, we're lucky to have examples of his sculpture, but he was also a printmaker. And late in his life, he embraced photography as well. So he's always kind of working across media. And in addition to being very interested in drawing, Degas was also revered Ong. And like Ong, he traveled to Italy as a young artist, and he was really struck by the work that he saw there, especially the frescoes. And what appealed to him about frescoes was their matte quality. So fresco is a type of mural painting that's made directly on wet plaster, so it dries very quickly, leaving this kind of matte and chalky effect. And, fresco is not very practical. It has to stay in a specific place. It's not very forgiving if you make a mistake. So it's not something that most artists in the 19th century were working with. However, Degas felt that he could kind of capture the matte effect of fresco through a use of pastel. And at this time, pastel were becoming increasingly readily available commercially. You were able to buy them in a large range of colors, which Degas did do, but he often altered the ones that he purchased or created his own because he really wanted a very specific type of material that would achieve this matte effect. And in addition to having a stylistic effect that appealed to Degas, pastel was also useful because it combines line and color in a single stroke. So you get the kind of contours that you think of with graphite or with chalk and charcoal, but at the same time, you're getting the vibrant colors of, other media like paint. This depiction here shows a jockey at the racetrack. This was a subject that captivated Degas. He turned to it regularly. In the 19th century, horse racing was a popular pastime. The racetracks at Longchamp, which are located on the west side of Paris, nearby to where the current day location of the French Open is, were a place that Degas visited regularly. His other popular subject matter that many people know him for depicting is the ballet. And at first glance, you might not think that the ballet and horse racing have very much to do with one another, but both are examples where you can see bodies in motion in unusual ways and places where you can see other spectators watching the event. And both of these subjects were really interesting to Degas. So here we see sort of the great potential of movement in the jockey. He's kind of leaning forward, he's ready to go. And the emphasis is given solely to the human figure. We just have these small, quick lines here to suggest the horse's back. So he's kind of removed from the overall context of the racetrack. It's about his kind of energy and potential, and the kind of rapid strokes of the pastel really emphasize this kind of sense of the possibility of motion. Degas would use his drawings for a variety of reasons. He has highly finished drawings that were meant to be exhibited. In some cases, they are preparatory works for later paintings. These two are not directly related to one another, but as I said, it's a subject that he returned to regularly. So you can see here kind of similar leaning forward of the jockey on horseback. This painting is on view downstairs in the Mellon Impressionism galleries right now. And like Degas, Paul Mellon was also passionate about horses and horse racing. And so equestrian subjects are something that we see often in the Mellon collections. This drawing is one that Mrs. Mellon gave to Mr. Mellon, and it was one of an early work that they collected together. And so kind of shared their shared interests. Mrs. Mellon was a kind of avid Francophile, and Mr. Mellon was very interested in horse racing. And so Degas was an area where their interests overlapped. As time went on, and I should, back up just a moment. So at the same time as Degas is creating these works, he looks at horse racing throughout his life. So he lives well into the 20th century. A photographer named Edward Muybridge is doing a series of photographic studies in California, where he is trying to take a series of rapid images to break down how horses move. And this kind of was revolutionary to people who had an understanding for the first time exactly like how the sequence broke out. And Degas was aware of this. As I said, later in his life, he would become a photographer himself. But this kind of scientific study affected the way that he approached horses and racing and how he depicted scenes. And so this kind of isolation of a single moment of the rider on the horse reminds us of Muybridge's photographs. But as time went on, post-impressionists, even as they began to move away from impressionism, they were less interested in capturing these fleeting and ephemeral moments of everyday life and more interested in color and form, sort of approaching it almost from a scientific perspective. Post-impressionists too kept an avid drawing practice. Cézanne was known to draw daily. Like the Delacroix, this is a sheet from a sketchbook that has been isolated from the rest of its context. Unlike Delacroix, who kept sketchbooks in a very kind of meticulous and linear fashion, so we have, examples of his travels to Africa and other works that are kind of all of the same theme. Cézanne worked across books, so he would work in one book one day and a different sketchbook the next day. He would put a sketchbook aside for a number of years and then return to it. So when we page through them, we don't always get a sense of chronology or sequence as he's working through a specific theme. That being said, this pine tree is a subject that he did return to quite often. It was located on his sister's farm in Aix-en-Provence, and it's a subject that he looked to regularly. And we know of examples, other drawings of it in collections in Zurich, and this work here, which is jointly owned by the Met and Harvard Art Museums. And you can see when you look at the two together, how important the paper support is. It really becomes part of the composition. So in our drawing, he has isolated just the trunk of the tree to stand in for the whole. So we see, the central trunk and the branches extending off of it. But in certain instances, like here, it just kind of stops and the drawing seems to bleed into the paper support. And so we have just this isolated fragment to stand for the tree in its entirety. And even as he's using line this way, he uses color in a very similar way. We see a patch of brown here to stand in for all of the bark of the tree, bits of blue here and here to suggest the way that the sky is visible through the pine needles and leaves. And again, he doesn't need to fill the whole composition or horizon with blue for us to understand that effect. In the Harvard example, he's using a bit more color, but he's still very judicious about it. Just a bit of green to suggest the pine needles. Again, small blocks of brown to show the tree as a whole. In his paintings, Cézanne was noted for leaving areas of unpainted canvas, bare canvas, this kind of, again, use of negative space as part of the composition, and also for what was called the constructive stroke of using areas of color and form to build up a larger composition. And in a way, he's doing that right here with the drawings where he's broken down the tree into pieces and kind of is sketching out and experimenting in order to put them back together. Drawing was very well suited for this kind of experimental approach. It is easy to take your sketchbook and your pencil and a small set of watercolors out into the landscape. Cézanne would have drawn this tree, from life. Likewise, it was much easier for Degas to bring, a sketchbook and some pastel to the racetrack. You can't exactly set up your easel and oil paints in the middle of the stands there. But drawing materials were easily accessible. They were far less expensive than oil paint and canvas, so that if you did have an experiment and you felt it didn't work out, you could start over again. The stakes were much lower. When I see here this little bit of cross-hatching by the branch, it works as a shadow, but there you can see, if you look closely, there's sort of something underneath too, which makes me wonder sometimes if, Cézanne did change his mind. I think he would have been shocked to see a drawing like this, framed and on view in an art museum. It's certainly not something that he thought of as a finished work, and the tension between finish and unfinished is always very murky, even in Cézanne's, complete compositions and paintings. And you can see here an example of the final painting that he created now in Russia based on the tree. So we have, in this instance, the whole tree, but you can see here the bits of bare canvas showing through in these rocks, like I was mentioning before. And these patches, kind of patchy application of color, is the constructive stroke that I was talking about just a minute ago. So these works were, experimental. It was a way for artists to kind of take risks, test things out, and explore to kind of create the revolutionary approaches to composition, line, color that we see in the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings that we know and love.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks everyone for coming.
Okay, bye.